which gave confirmation to the idea that Mr Farquhar was thinking of Ruth for a wife. She craved with stinging curiosity to hear something of their affairs every day, partly because the torture which such intelligence gave was almost a relief from the deadness of her heart to all other interests. And so spring, Giovento dell'anno, came back to her, bringing all the contrasts which spring alone can bring to add to the heaviness of the soul. The little winged creatures filled the air with bursts of joy. The vegetation came bright and hopefully onwards, without any check of nipping frost. The ash trees in the Bradshaws' garden were out in leaf by the middle of May, which that year wore more the aspect of summer than most Junes do. The sunny weather mocked Jemima, and the unusual warmth oppressed her physical powers. She felt very weak and languid. She was acutely sensible that no one else noticed her want of strength. Father, mother, all seemed too full of other things to care, if, as she believed, her life was waning. She herself felt glad it was so, but her delicacy was not unnoticed by all. Her mother often anxiously asked her husband if he did not think Jemima was looking ill, nor did his affirmation to the contrary satisfy her, as most of his affirmations did. She thought every morning, before she got up, how she could tempt Jemima to eat, by ordering some favourite dainty for dinner. In many other little ways she tried to minister to her child, but the poor girl's own abrupt irritability of temper had made her mother afraid of openly speaking to her about her health. Ruth, too, saw that Jemima was not looking well. How she had become an object of dislike to her former friend she did not know, but she was sensible that Miss Bradshaw disliked her now. She was not aware that this feeling was growing and strengthening almost into repugnance, for she seldom saw Jemima out of school hours, and then only for a minute or two. But the evil element of a fellow creature's dislike oppressed the atmosphere of her life. That fellow creature was one who had loved her so fondly, and whom she still loved, although she had learnt to fear her, as we fear those whose faces cloud over when we come in sight, who cast unloving glances at us, of which we, though not seeing, are conscious, as of some occult influence, and the cause of whose dislike is unknown to us, though every word and action seems to increase it. I believe that this sort of dislike is only shown by the jealous, and that it renders the disliker even more miserable, because more continually conscious than the object. But the growing evidence of Jemima's feeling made Ruth very unhappy at times. This very May, too, an idea had come into her mind, which she had tried to repress, namely, that Mr Farquhar was in love with her. It annoyed her extremely. It made her reproach herself that she ever should think that such a thing possible. She tried to strangle the notion, to drown it, to starve it out by neglect. Its existence caused her such pain and distress. The worst was, he had won Leonard's heart, who was constantly seeking him out, or, when absent, talking about him. The best was some journey connected with business, which would take him to the Continent for several weeks, and during that time surely this disagreeable fancy of his would die away, if untrue, and if true, some way would be opened by which she might put a stop to all increase of predilection on his part, and yet retain him as a friend for Leonard, that darling for whom she was far-seeing and covetous, and miserly of every scrap of love and kindly regard. Mr Farquhar would not have been flattered if he had known how much his departure contributed to Ruth's rest of mind on the Saturday afternoon on which he set out on his journey. It was a beautiful day. The sky of that intense quivering blue which seemed as though you could look through it for ever, yet not reach the black infinite space which is suggested as lying beyond. Now and then a thin, torn, vaporous cloud floated slowly within the vaulted depth, but the soft air that gently wafted it was not perceptible among the leaves on the trees, which did not even tremble. Ruth sat at her work in the shadow formed by the old grey garden wall. Miss Benson and Sally, the one in the parlour window seat mending stockings, the other hard at work in her kitchen, were both within talking distance, for it was weather for open doors and windows; but none of the three kept up any continued conversation, and in the intervals Ruth sang low a brooding song, such as she remembered her mother singing long ago. Now and then she stopped to look at Leonard, who was labouring away with vehement energy at digging over a small plot of ground, where he meant to prick out some celery plants that had been given to him. Ruth's heart warmed at the earnest, spirited way in which he thrust his large spade deep down into the brown soil, his ruddy face glowing, his curly hair wet with the exertion. And yet she sighed to think that the days were over when her deeds of skill could give him pleasure. Now his delight was in acting himself. Last year, not 14 months ago, he had watched her making a daisy chain for him, as if he could not admire her cleverness enough. This year, this week, when she had been devoting every spare hour to the simple tailoring which she performed for her boy, she had always made every article he wore, and felt almost jealous of the employment. He had come to her with a wistful look, and asked her when he might begin to have clothes made by a man. Ever since the Wednesday when she had accompanied Mary and Elizabeth, at Mrs Bradshaw's desire, to be measured for spring clothes by the new Eccleston dressmaker, she had been looking forward to this Saturday afternoon's pleasure of making summer trousers for Leonard; but the satisfaction of the employment was a little taken away by Leonard's speech. It was a sign, however, that her life was very quiet and peaceful, that she had leisure to think upon the thing at all, and often she forgot it entirely in her low chanting song, or in listening to the thrush warbling out his afternoon ditty to his patient mate in the holly bush below. The distant rumble of carts through the busy streets (it was market day) not only formed a low rolling bass to the nearer and pleasanter sounds, but enhanced the sense of peace by the suggestion of the contrast afforded to the repose of the garden by the bustle not far off. But, besides physical din and bustle, there is mental strife and turmoil. That afternoon, as Jemima was restlessly wandering about the house, her mother desired her to go on an errand to Mrs Pearson's, the new dressmaker, in order to give some directions about her sister's new frocks. Jemima went, rather than have the trouble of resisting, or else she would have preferred staying at home, moving or being outwardly quiet according to her own fitful will. Mrs Bradshaw, who, as I have said, had been aware for some time that something was wrong with her daughter, and was very anxious to set it to rights if she only knew how, had rather planned this errand with a view to dispel Jemima's melancholy. "And Mimie, dear," said her mother, "when you are there, look out for a new bonnet for yourself, for she has got some very pretty ones, and your old one is so shabby." "It does for me, mother," said Jemima heavily. "I don't want a new bonnet." "But I want you to have one, my lassie. I want my girl to look well and nice." There was something of homely tenderness in Mrs Bradshaw's tone that touched Jemima's heart. She went to her mother, and kissed her with more of affection than she had shown to any one for weeks before, and the kiss was returned with warm fondness. "I think you love me, mother," said Jemima. "We all love you, dear, if you would but think so; and if you want anything, or wish for anything, only tell me, and with a little patience I can get your father to give it you, I know. Only be happy, there's a good girl."